Great. Hey, everybody. Woj back here for another episode of the Vectra AI podcast. This time, we've been fielding a lot of questions, kind of one by one, on this new Palo Alto vulnerability that was released. And I thought, heck, instead of trying to answer all of the questions literally one by one, let's record a podcast on this. So I invited Fabien in to kind of help break down kind of this vulnerability and what it means for our customers and prospects alike. So Fabien, I'll let you introduce yourself. I think people might be familiar with you because you did the Midnight Blizzard podcast we did last week. So, but heck, why don't you reintroduce yourself to the audience?
Sure, Woj, and thank you for having me. So my name is Fabien Guillot. I have been at Vectra for about 5 years. I'm the technical marketing lead here. I have been working in cybersecurity my whole life. I love packets, I love protocols, blue teamer at heart. I've been working many years for different value-added resellers before moving to the US and working for multiple vendors and end up at Vectra. And by the way, if you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn or my email, just feel free.
Fabien's a good person for everybody to know and get to know. He's fantastic to work with and a wealth of information, which is why you'll probably see his face on this podcast many times and hear his voice as well. So thank you, Fabien, for taking the time to join us today.
I appreciate the kind words. So in a nutshell, let's go straight in here. So what it is, so the vulnerability that was disclosed on April 10, a couple of days ago, but Volexity, that actually identified this zero-day exploitation of a Palo Alto firewall in the wild for some of their customers. And the CVE is 2024-3400, and it is an unauthenticated remote control execution vulnerability, a pure 0-day on Palo Alto firewall running GlobalProtect. And it has a score of 10. So if you're not familiar with the scoring of CVE, that goes from 1 to 10, and 10 being the most critical. And we're right there. Because why? You can actually execute any kind of code that you like on the Palo firewall without being authenticated. Make it extremely critical. It was impacting multiple PAN-OS versions, and a patch already started to be rolled out by Palo Alto, starting last Sunday on the 14th of April. But there's more to be rolled out, right? Not all version has been patched yet, and you can follow that link to see which patch has been released and when they expect to release the next patch. It has been reported to be actively exploited already out there. So very urgent to patch, very urgent to deploy solutions that can actually block those kind of attempts. Out there, there's many tools actually you can use to identify, vulnerables, Palo Alto devices out there that has been used by attackers. So Shodan is one example where you have a query that you can use to identify easily every kind of Palo Alto firewall that has GlobalProtect enabled and that may be vulnerable. There is another project that has been released where you can use a Palo Alto scanner to actually identify which version of the OS a specific device is running, so you know if it's vulnerable or not. So you can also use those tools to figure out if you actually are in those database. Could be very helpful, useful. So lately, it has been very busy with those kind of vulnerabilities or 0 days. So at least a couple of them. And, the headline is just, it's not going to stop, right? There is always been 0 day. There has always been new vulnerabilities discovered, and you need to be prepared for that. Lately, a couple of weeks ago, there was that backdoor in XZUtils that was discovered, extremely critical, a lot of coverage in there, including some blog posts that we put in our blog. But earlier this year as well, it was the ConnectWise Screen Connect vulnerability. Both of them got a score of 10, right? ConnectWise, you can actually completely bypass the authentication and just access the remote access solutions. Before that, one that has made a lot of noise as well, that has actually 9.8 score, is a remote unauthenticated API access to Eventi solutions. So has been extremely critical as well. And the Fortinet that added to the list, that was just July last year, but also made enough of noise just based on how many Fortinet are out there, where it has also a remote code executions vulnerability in the FortiOS and the FortiProxy. So that goes on and on. That's the most critical for the last couple of months. But you can just expect there is more out there, right? There is more vulnerabilities that probably has not been discovered. The same way that Volexity find out about this one. So what does it tell us, right? I think at Vectra, we always kind of assume that you can be compromised, right? Everyone can be compromised or may be compromised, right? So you have to get the right system in place and build a solid detection and response strategy to uncover attacker behavior within your environment. If you get breached, if someone get in, like this is the case with an exploit like that, and it has a foothold in your environment, have solution in place to be able to track any movements that the attacker can do after that initial foothold.
Yeah, I think internally we often talk, Fabien, about, you know, exposure is a good word that's used a lot in security world, and I think a lot of times it's kind of through the discussion around, you know, exposure to compromise. You have the right controls in place, are your prevention controls working, are they effective, et cetera, et cetera. Vulnerabilities are obviously, you know, kind of fall into that umbrella. But based on like what you're alluding to here is equally as important, if I hear you right, equally as important is to understand your exposure post-compromise. Like once they're in, what are they doing? Where are they moving? What are they accessing, et cetera, et cetera. So take us through a little bit about what we're already seeing in this world.
Yeah, you're correct. That's why we always have like, this is not only about north-south kind of traffic that you need to analyze. It's not only about like having a perimeter set and everything that inside the organization is safe. Is also looking at, you know, east-west traffic and understanding what's happening within an environment and finding anything that is wrong within it. So this is exactly what we're going to dive in the next section of the presentation, which is kind of the heart of what we want to expose here. So, you know, after this initial access, and actually Volexity, you know, kind of introduce a bit about what kind of backdoor, what kind of like binary or technique were used to get control on the Palo Alto firewall. There was that custom Python backdoor called Upstyle. That's very interesting in the way that works. Can very, you know, recommend that you read a bit about it. But what's important is like once you get in, if you can execute any code on that firewall, what's next, right? For the attacker, yeah, you're gonna pivot, right? And what they disclose in their blog post is like the threat actors is leveraging this exploit as an endpoint to move laterally within the victim organizations. So nothing new here, right? You get a foothold, you want to move the target. And what's important to note here is this is a Palo Alto operating systems, right? There is no way you can install any EDR, right? So there is no detection capability built into that appliances that will allow you to detect any kind of sign of compromise. So this is where, you know, having, in addition to whatever EDR endpoint coverage you have, having visibility on your network, having 100% coverage on every IP connected device in your environment can help to kind of fill that gaps and avoid any kind of blind spot in your environment. And we're going to just dive down into those behaviors and how network traffic analysis can actually uncover certain threat. After the attacker gets in, one of the things we can read about what they were able to do is to dump the configuration of the Palo Alto firewall. And you can learn a lot about an environment when you look at the configuration on the firewall, right? From IP address space, Active Directory and whatnot, because when you authenticate remote access users, right, you have to authenticate them most likely toward your Active Directory or LDAP server, or maybe for user identifications component within Palo Alto Firewall, you may have credentials, or you actually have credentials in the firewall that we can extract. And most likely, that's actually what has been related, that dumping the firewall configurations, able to access information about our credentials that can be used to further progress in the environment. So you don't even have to kind of, I don't know, brute force an account or try to find anything like that. You have credentials right there that you can use to move within the environment.
The attack turns immediately into an identity-based attack, like almost automatically. Like they just it becomes an identity-based attack largely, living on the network.
Correct. And you know already where the Active Directory is. You already know about probably, the IP address of like some high privileged servers or whatnot, because it's all in the configuration of the firewall, right? So ton of information you can get from there without even kind of do any kind of recon. But it was reported a couple of interesting behavior related to lateral movement, right? So the usage of SMB, RDP, and WinRM connections from the Palo Alto device to multiple systems within the environment. There was also information about targeting the domain backup data protection API keys. And that's extremely critical. If you're not familiar with DPAPI, this is a mechanism that allows you to encrypt secret on your workstation. So if you have Chrome or Edge installed on your computer, this is actually using DPAPI and a key that you have on your computer to encrypt all those secrets. Stealing the backup key in the domain controllers allow you to decrypt every secret on every workstation in the domain. So if an attacker gets his hand on that, that's mostly game over, right? So that's what they were targeting. There was also information in that blog regarding targeting NTDS directory information tree, which is basically storing all the information of the Active Directory, including password hashes. So you can actually offline start brute forcing that, and you will find a lot of credentials in there. They were targeting users' workstations, according to that report. So Barry tried commands to actually get the login data, cookies, DPAPI keys. To be honest, if you already have the backup DPAPI key, you don't even need this one. But yeah, you can kind of get all the profile, know the bookmarks. You will actually know exactly which system they access, which password in their store in the web browsers have been used, and you can extract that, which allow you to pivot to more resources. You can also imagine that you can also jump to other systems, like maybe a SaaS systems, maybe some Microsoft 365, maybe some AWS account. As soon as you have a hold on that, even cookie, right? Imagine you get the cookie from the Entra ID authentication, like, you don't even have to use MFA anymore. The cookie, installing this cookie would just get you right in whatever system has MFA turned on. And then they use all those valid credentials to move further in the environment. And this is only focusing on lateral movement here, but you can think like, what can the attacker will have done in terms of reconnaissance, right? So there is a ton of information in the configuration of the firewall itself. But okay, you have already credentials to access the Active Directory, right? Use LDAP, dump the entire content of the LDAP tree, where you have all the workstation, all the users, etc. Start kind of like mapping out the network. So you can imagine there were actually probably more activities also on the reconnaissance side, and not only on the lateral movement, but not so much has been communicated about some technique that could have been used by the attackers. And of course, as you uncover more credentials, you can expect even more lateral movement, right? To more strategic asset in the organization.
Yeah. No wonder it's a 10.
Yeah, 10 is no joke. 10 is no joke. So how about detecting those post-compromise behavior? using network traffic. And we can only talk about so much in this brief on the models that we provide to cover and to detect attacker behaviors. So we're really focusing on lateral movement here and give you a brief of what AI can do, what kind of models we have built in our solutions to detect those behavior we just went through. So the first one I call out,
detect them with the least amount of latency as possible, because
correct.
latency in this scenario is a killer, right? The longer it takes to detect post-compromise behavior, which we believe AI is the best way to do that, and the models that we built. But the longer it takes to detect that, the more, Fabio, you just described all the potential things they can do, the access they have. They'll live and thrive in latency. So the longer it takes us to defend against them, to catch them, to see what they're doing post-compromise, the more successful they're going to be, right?
Yeah, good, totally. And this is why at Vectra, we're facing those challenges as we want to build models, AI models that are also deal with a lot of data, but is also very reactive and can actually trigger within minutes. We're far here from just like seeing a packet and triggering the detections like an IPS. We deal with collecting data across the environment, compiling that data, analyzing that data for each and every models, and be able to detect those behavior based on what's normal and not normal. So it's a very complex problem to solve that our data scientists and our engineering has been working for years to build those models and mature them to not only be efficient but real time. So here, pick a mix of 3 different models: machine-based, user-based. They are all unsupervised, meaning they all require like learning for a period of time to understand what's possible. But the first one is suspicious admin. And what suspicious admin model for us is actually focusing on protocols that are used by administrator. So it's like VNC, it's SSH, it's TeamViewer, it could be Telnet, IPMI, all those kind of protocols, but including WinRM. So WinRM was one of the ways to kind of move laterally. And these specific protocols would provide the coverage for these specific models. We provide the coverage for that. It's has a kind of 10 days learning. It will understand which host actually normally use those protocols to connect to which server. And if anything after the learning kind of happen outside of what we learn, we're going to have error detections. So you can imagine if we see a Palo Alto firewall starting to do WinRM connection to a lot of workstations or different servers that has never done before using WinRM, we're going to kind of start, firing detection and say that's not normal, the type of things we seeing from that device. The second one I want to talked about is the suspicious remote execution. And tools like PSExec or things like that are very common for administrators. They typically use that technique where her endpoint, we kind of use RPC or RPC over SMB to do a remote call to an endpoint on the different host to execute some command. It could be WMI as well. But here we're going to learn, okay, which host also unsupervised, kind of machine learning, understanding which host normally call to which host using which RPC endpoint or UUID, which name pipe, which operations, kind of build that learning of like what's happened normally. And again, if the Palo Alto firewall never have done any kind of RPC request using a specific name pipe or specific UUID, starting to query a lot of different endpoints, a lot of different hosts, same. We're just going to fire directly your detections, highlighting that is not normal for that host to do that type of behavior. And as detection piles up coming from that host, we're also going to prioritize it, and you're going to know that something is going on from that. Finally, the last one I want to talk about is the Privileged Access Analytics Suite. This one is completely based on Kerberos. And in a Windows environment, you have Kerberos everywhere, but you can learn a lot about Kerberos. So we just look at every Kerberos communications in the network, and we learn about the three entities, right? So user, host, and services. And we observe based on the communications, we kind of deduct some observed privilege, right? Based on how much someone connect to services and whatnot, we are actually gonna rate or give a score to every entity, user, host, of services in the environment to understand who is privileged and who is not privileged. And we kind of build a map of like who is normally communicating with, which service is critical, which host is actually privileged or user privilege. And then based on that learning, unsupervised again, we are going to detect any anomaly in any edge, right? So it could be this user has never connected to that service, or this host has never seen that user connecting to that service. So it's kind of all the different edge where there is an anomaly, we're gonna, based on the learning that we had, we're gonna fire detections. So even, yeah, completely Kerberos based, this one, but we could potentially, the Palo Alto firewall was indeed using Kerberos for any type of authentications. If any kind of access to other systems was performed, we're going to see, okay, these credentials that were used on the Palo Alto firewall to connect to that services using Kerberos, that never happened before. And that will have fired directly at detections. Even more if we actually say that that service is critical. We observe that service is only accessed by administrator. We know that it has a very high score. If that happened, we're going to raise directly a detections, and it's going to raise the score of that host to be investigated. So just an overview of like, a couple of the models that we build that will allow to find all those different kind of detection technique. And there is not one model covering all of them, right? So you see, depending of like which kind of lateral movements, which kind of techniques, we have different models covering different type of techniques. Yeah, so to summarize about Vectra AI, and we always end up with that slide, providing like what we think is important. And you know that better than anyone would.
Yeah.
Good coverage, right? So here we're very network centric, right? We can imagine that, it's always expand to something else at some point, but here was very like NDR centric, be able to focus also on identity for Active Directory. So having that visibility will provide you, the coverage to detect any kind of movements that was performed by the attacker after exploiting this vulnerability. The clarity. So we have AI not only for our detection, but also for prioritizing what needs to be investigated by the SOC. So we have AI prioritization technology that will score every entity, account, or host in an environment. And if we see multiple behavior from a specific entity, in this case, will be probably the Palo Alto firewall, exposing different behavior that looks suspicious, we're going to raise and kind of prioritize this entity as being critical or something urgent that you need to work on, and kind of on top of the list from what the analyst should work on. And finally, the control. Detecting is the first step that is so important, but then comes the response. And we have native response in our platform that could be leveraged to take automatic actions. So imagine whatever credentials were compromised initially in the Palo Alto configuration or in the Palo Alto device, if that specific account was used to start moving laterally to different workstations or server, we could have trigger automatically lockdown of this account. So blocking out, disabling this account, and preventing this account to be used again to move to any other systems. Also, other system to maybe block certain, use firewalls or maybe SASE to block certain workstation that we believe to be compromised, because that escalates quickly if you actually start collecting credentials on different points of the network. So also something you can leverage. The last thing is you can expect that on workstation, EDR will be installed, even if it could not be installed on the firewall. So the ability to isolate hosts automatically. So if we know that certain hosts, they may have, move laterally, maybe, who knows, maybe start an implant, starting to kind of make his way, you can automatically, with the Vectra platform, isolate, quarantine a host using the EDR. So just doing an API call to whatever EDR you have, and we're gonna isolate the host to prevent him to further attack.
Yeah.
So that's about it for this
awesome.
this talk.
I learned a ton from you walking through that. It was interesting because we've been on other podcasts where we've talked about identity-based attacks and we've talked about Scattered Spider, we talked about Midnight Blizzard, we talked about all these different kind of attack scenarios and different tactics they use and techniques they use. And it's interesting about this vulnerability and like what an attacker can do with it, because we've often talked about, or at least I have, I'm like, attackers need two things to be real successful. They need a network and they need an identity. They get those two things, they're going to be highly successful in progressing their attack and et cetera, et cetera. Well, it just so happens with this vulnerability, they get both of those in one, potentially, right, if they exploit it. So I love, you kind of summarized our 3 C's. The 3 C's are near and dear to my heart: coverage, clarity, and control. It's like, can we see it? Can we stop it? How fast can we see it and stop it? At the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. Right? Coverage is, can we see it? Control, can we stop it? Clarity, you can't, the more signal you have, the better clarity you have, the ability to feed that SOC analyst a clear, prioritized signal. Well, that's gonna aid tremendously in removing latency around how fast can you actually see it and stop it. So great way to tie it all together, Fabien. That was fantastic. There's a ton of resources that are available on this vulnerability out in the market. Great. Oh yeah, you have a few.
Yeah, I put a couple
right
of
here.
resources. That's always good to have a bunch of reading to do afterwards. There is a lot of blog posts out there that describe a bit more about vulnerabilities, how it has been discovered. That's also very interesting, because that those 0-day are out there, but to find out that they exist, that's actually very interesting reading. Palo Alto blog, of course, and I put something regarding our resources as well, right? So the AI behind Vectra, which actually go a bit more deeper into what I presented about certain detection and models that we built to detect that. That's a good further reading as well.
Yep. Awesome. This was fantastic, Fabien.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for taking the time. And hey, everybody, thanks for tuning in. I think this is episode 7 of our 2024 series on podcasts. We're going to be pushing these out once a week at least. Different topics, like we just talked candidly with members of the product team, like Fabien, and John Mancini's been on a couple of these, and others. You'll see some familiar faces. So if you have time, check out some of the other episodes we threw out in the last couple of weeks. We did one on Midnight Blizzard, Scattered Spider. We kind of walked through some interesting insights around phishing attacks and ransomware attacks and hybrid cloud attacks. So you can see them on YouTube. They're on our playlist on the Vectra AI page on YouTube. And again, Fabien, thanks for taking the time. This was awesome. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Good one.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.